Good morning, guys. Today we are working on page 21 of your reader, and we are looking at the narrative perspective of the story Lad that we just finished. Turn some light on. Okay, so you guys have already done a summary of our story, but looking at the chart, the first thing it asks us to do is to summarize the important events in the narrative. So we are going to do a quick summary of the events. So we're not going to really go in and discuss much about Lad and the kind of dog he is here. We're just going to look at the events of the story. So the first major event we have is that Lad saves the mistress from potentially drowning. Okay? Then, once we have Lad saves her from drowning, which is kind of two events in one, right? The mistress is drowning, and then Lad saves her. But don't you love how we combine that into one sentence so you don't have to write two? The next event that happens is that the mistress becomes very sick. She gets pneumonia. Okay. Then, I think the last event that's not as much of a major event, but it's important to understanding the relationship between Lad and the mistress and the master, is that Lad is allowed to stay in the house. At the end, where all the other dogs needed to figure out somewhere else to go so they could be quiet, Lad is allowed to stay in the house. And I'm going to use my little with symbol, W/with the mistress. Hopefully while she recovers. So those are kind of our key events. Not necessarily key details, but key events. Then the second question says, what do you learn about Lad? What do we learn about Lad through third-person narration? So we talked about this a little bit in my group. We talked about how because it's told by a narrator that was told in third person, and it was limited third person, so the narrator really only knew the thoughts of Lad. We didn't hear much about the mistress or the master and what they thought or their feelings or anything like that. We learned about Lad's personality. So we learned what Lad liked. Well, let me clear that out real quick, guys. No, it's not going to go. Okay, what he liked, what he disliked. Let's see, there we go. So we learned that he liked his master and his mistress. He liked his land. We learned that he disliked strangers. We knew Lad's thoughts and some of his actions throughout the story. We knew some of his feelings, but not on a real, intimate, personal level. So we knew some, and I'm going to emphasize some, because we really didn't know all of his feelings or not necessarily all of his thoughts either, but we knew some thoughts, some feelings, some actions. So the third question leads us to how that would change if it were told from first person. So in this story, first person would have been if the story had been told from Lad's point of view. How would the story have changed? How would it be a little different? So we already knew what he liked and disliked. So that would not have changed much. we might have had a little, and not even, I know, not even too much more elaboration, because we even knew why he disliked the strangers. He didn't like the way they petted him, that annoyed him, they stared at him. So we knew a lot about the why, that elaboration of his likes and dislikes. What would have changed is if Lad had told us his thoughts and his feelings. That would have been a little different. Okay, so on our third block, we're going to talk a little bit more about we would have known Lad's thoughts and feelings. I'm going to use just the word better for now. We would have known them better on a deeper level. And for example, what I mean here is when the mistress was drowning, we knew Lad's actions. We knew what he did to save her. But in that moment, we didn't know, and I'm going to put some for thoughts too. We knew his actions. We knew everything he did throughout the story. But we didn't know how he was feeling in that moment. You know, if it had been told from Lad's point of view, we would have heard the story sound a little bit more like, I started to panic. I was scared. What was happening? I dashed for, or I swam as hard as I could to reach the mistress, but she was so heavy. We would have known so much more about the thoughts he was having in that moment and how that made him feel. So we would have known a lot more about Lad's thoughts and his feelings in the events. And I'm going to kind of just put an arrow and emphasize during the events of the story. Okay, so we knew a lot about his thoughts and feelings of just his general surroundings, the people, the land, his master, his mistress. But we didn't get a lot of the details on his thoughts and feelings during the events of the story. So that would have probably made it a lot more intense, the story itself, but we kind of would have been like, ooh, when you're watching a good movie and all that action's taking place and you can see the characters and how they're responding, we would have known better how he thought and how he felt during those intense moments, like when the mistress was sick, when she was drowning, and those moments where he was really worried. We would have been able to understand his worry. So I want you to think about that, and maybe even which story do you think would have been better? The one that we read in third person narration, or would you have preferred that same story been told from Lad's point of view? So think about that and come to class today with your chart filled out. You might need to go back or just pause and write down our little notes and then be ready to talk about it. See you guys in a little bit.